Matt, welcome to the show. I don't usually start introductions this way. This is a little bit different, but just like we talked about before, we have met. We met in November of 2022. At the time we're recording this, it is January 27th, 2026. It's a very crazy full circle moment for my listeners. He spoke at my high school. I went up to him. I had some questions for him, but I have a notebook that I got out of the vault, and it was notes that I took when we had when he was presenting at my high school, and he said something very interesting that I kind of wanted to get the conversation going with. So you said, and I quote, I thought this was interesting. You said, worry about your mental health, and everything will take care of itself. I thought that was a very good message. So I just wrote it down, not thinking much of it. However, now in 2026, you are currently the CEO of Modern Health, which is a company that is all about mental health for employees. So I found it very interesting how you had the message. It was part of your morals about mental health, keeping up with yourself, making sure you're good.
Yep.
How do your morals on mental health make you a better CEO, especially at a company that focuses all about mental health?
Sure. So a lot to unpack there. Well, first, it's nice to see you again, and I'm very grateful for the invitation to be here. It's been about a little 3.5, 4 years since we last connected. My hair is a lot more gray than of it. So as I look at you now, I wish I looked like when I was in 2022. So to answer your question, I may have mentioned this before. I don't remember, but um, issues of mental health have been, part of my life for as far back as I can remember. And I say that because I think I mentioned this. My mother is a psychologist, so my mother got her PhD in psychology. She spent a lot of time focused on early childhood development for a whole host of reasons. And my mom was very much my mentor, and she was sort of my hero growing up. Still is. And I always respected what she did. I remember her coming home exhausted from work, because the work of a provider, practitioner is emotionally draining. The hours are long. It's generally thankless, and you really see tough stuff every day. So I always had a great appreciation for what she did for a living. Um, and when I got the opportunity to join Modern Health, it was a very easy decision for me, because I care about what the company does. It, was very present in my upbringing and in my life. And I'm really proud of what we do. I like to tell people I have the additional benefit. My mental health is much better than it used to be because my mom is now finally proud to tell people what I do for a living for the first time in my career, given her career, and that obviously makes me feel good. But yeah, that's sort of the genesis of the background, and why I have such an affinity to the content of what we do. And then I'm very grateful that we've got a team of people that I get to work with every day, many of whom I've worked with before in my career. And when you can go to work every day and you can be yourself, and you have people looking after you and you're looking after them, not that you want days to fly by, but they tend to go by pretty fast, and each day is fairly engaging. So in many regards, I've just been very, very blessed, and I'm grateful for the role that I have.
Yeah, that's a great answer. As far as so you mentioned the kind of the past as for why the reason for you joining, like being part of Modern Health. Now that like you have this frame of mind, right? This is something you dealt with back in your childhood and your life, and something that I guess has close ties with you as your mom was involved in this, I guess, area, not in business, but more psychologist side. Looking into the future, how does having this vision of wanting to help more people in mental health, knowing,
Yeah.
you and probably other people have gone through similar things, contribute to you as a CEO and kind of what you look for in the company and what you want to happen?
Yeah, no, it's a very thoughtful question. So, um, the woman who founded our company, her name's Allison Watson. She's terrific. An incredible entrepreneur, wonderful human being, just very classy person. Back in 2017, 2018, 2019, she was very passionate about the space, because um, for a couple of different reasons. Number one, there is a mismatch between providers and demand. So the demand for mental health services eclipses the amount of people that we have available to provide those services. And when you get into things like rural communities, it gets even more like the coverage ratios are just much more challenging. Number two, the types of services that were traditionally offered to corporate buyers called EAPs, employee assistance programs, were for some clients insufficient. In other words, the richness of the benefit, its availability, its utilization was also mismatched to the issues that companies were experiencing. So coming up with a better tool or better set of services was really important. And finally, this will probably resonate with you. You know, when I was growing up, and I'm a little bit older than you, obviously, but when I was growing up, you generally didn't talk about mental health issues. People would acknowledge that that people suffering from mental health issues were real, but people would be more embarrassed to talk about it, or it generally was just not as accepted, in society to talk about this stuff. As things, as the world has turned and time has gone by, that's just not the case anymore. And people are much more open to talking about their own mental health issues. Those who are in therapy have no issue talking about it. You have parts of the globe where today, like in India, for example, there are companies where employees will sit in the same waiting room to meet with the same therapist, basically everybody acknowledging that they're all, seeking treatment. So, and then of course with COVID was the great tailwind to all of this, and really exposed how pervasive issues of mental health are and the need to tackle them head on. It was sort of a perfect storm of circumstances, which has, added to the tailwind in the industry. So for people like me who've seen this evolution over time, it's very gratifying, in the fact that people can speak more openly about their issues, etc. And the fact that the solutions to deal with them are more sophisticated than they were heretofore. I think everybody wins. I think the other bit too, I don't know if I'd call it tailwind or whatever, but the world's just a lot more complicated even than when I was growing up. When I was a little bit younger than you are, back when I first met, after school, you obviously did your homework, you had sports, whatever, but you'd go out with your friends or you'd play in the backyard or whatever. Today people are on devices all the time, and those have caused extraordinary issues of mental health, particularly with younger people. So there's just enough sort of circumstances, societal and otherwise, which make the topic very relevant for today. I'm just grateful that that people are more open to talking about it, acknowledging it, and investing in it. And the onus is on folks like us to keep continuing to innovate and come up with solutions that address those needs.
I know that modern health deals with a lot of people who have moderate to severe cases, especially when it comes to like giving employers the access to all these tools for their employees to be able to be helped, right? But do you think that there are things that, before the intervention is needed, people can do to help them?
Oh, absolutely, and I think that you have to really distinguish between severe mental illness, um, versus more moderate forms. So, in other words, someone who is schizophrenic or suicidal, people who have severe substance abuse issues, other addictions, that's serious mental illness, and there's care paths to address that. But things like depression, anxiety, etc., we all suffer from, and how we cope with it day to day, can distinguish between whether you slip into a further case of severity or not. Um, and a lot of it, sadly, is societal, and and I don't want to turn this into a political discussion, but there are enormous societal inequities, and certain people have exposure and live in environments where dealing with some of these issues is a little bit easier than others. And then there are other cases, like I said, in rural environments in particular, where there's just not a lot of where it's tougher to get care, it's not as fair. Um, but for us and what we've built here, which I'm very proud of, I didn't build it. Allison and the team built it, and we're innovating on it. But she came up with this model, which is called adaptive care, which is to say, not everybody needs to be in therapy. Um, those that do, we need to identify quickly and get them on a quick care path to therapy. But not everybody needs a therapist. Some of our competitors came out with models that are more therapy first. We're a little bit different. Where we're the same is that everybody who needs to be in therapy, gets it quickly, gets a panel of providers that they can choose from, and then they go. What we have done is offered what we call different modalities. So we have things like coaches, we have online content, we have group sessions. There's lots of different ways to have a care journey in our model. And what's important, because while it is critical that anybody who needs therapy gets it, it may not be the best modality given the situation. For example, I may have levels of anxiety due to financial stress. Again, not to turn this into something terribly political, but a couple months ago, when the tariff debate started to sort of take on a life of its own, you had people saying, "Well, geez, now I'm worried about retirement readiness, and my 401k took a hit, and now I'm stressed out financially." Well, in some cases, depending on other dimensions of that person's mental health, they may need a therapist. But if it's simply financial stress, well, maybe a coach, a financial planner, et cetera. There may be a better course of care to deal with that issue. So for us, sort of building or expanding on your question, I think the key is getting the diagnosis right and then having a care path that's very bespoke to what the person's going through, but not necessarily throwing therapy at every intervention because it may not be the most helpful modality, and it's very expensive. So for companies in particular who are paying for the benefit, they want the best yield on their dollar spent. They want to be able to, or they want to be convinced that there's a return on the money they're spending. And one way to do that is by offering, like I said, these different modalities depending on the circumstance.
Yeah, one of the things, Matt, that really sticks out with how you're speaking, which I find extremely captivating, is you seem to have a lot of empathy for the fact that people are going through this. I think life experiences maybe can give you some form of empathy, especially when you're able to be in a position to help people with something that you used to struggle with, right?
Yep.
How do you think, because I feel like, I totally agree with the fact that, the area of which where we grew up, it was more like, work hard, keep your head down, like
Yeah.
if you have mental health issues, like, no, you don't, like that's not like that's not happening, right? So
Yeah.
how how can we open up more people to the idea of this being a real issue and show people that like to be empathetic for these things that are happening?
Yeah, well, let me answer that in a couple different ways. First, I'm really happy that you use the term empathy, because I I had a professor in business school. His name was Marvin Zonis. I had the good fortune of going to business school on the South Side at the University of Chicago, and Professor Zonis did a lot of things in his career, but towards the end of his career, he taught a leadership class that I took. It was probably my favorite class at the University of Chicago. And he was he was a terrific storyteller, very funny guy. But when he got down to it and he talked about, what distinguishes really good leaders, or what competencies, characteristics, et cetera, distinguish really good leaders from not good leaders. And, the number one category or the number one characteristic he would always point to is empathy. In other words,
Oh,
if you want to lead an organization, you better figure out ways to make connections with people, or at the very least, make sure that they felt heard. You may not always agree. We may not always make decisions that are in support of what someone wants, but as long as they feel respected and listened to, you can move an organization forward. So, um, And I would say I had the good fortune, like I said, of being raised by a therapist who, in moments where I didn't necessarily always demonstrate great empathy, pointed it out to me. The other implication to all of this, of course, is, and what Professor Zonas went out of his way to remind us, from a gender perspective. Well, I'll ask you, in your experience, are men or women generally more empathetic human beings?
I would say probably women.
Yeah, but only by a lot. Um, and so I think about that a lot, and I happen to believe that, which is why I've really gone out of my way. As I've built teams over time, I'm fiercely meritocratic. Like everybody's got to earn it. But I have taken notice of what Professor Zona said, and if you look at how the teams that I've been a part of or led have been sort of constructed over time, let's just say that the importance of empathy and the fact that certain women tend to demonstrate empathy better than men has impacted how I've thought about um, constructing teams. To pivot quickly then to your question, I think it's really important for what we do, um, in terms of acknowledging mental health as an issue or acknowledging when people are struggling. I think it's really important, to demonstrate a real caring about this stuff, because if if you're suffering from a mental health issue, it affects everything. If I have anxiety, if I am depressed, fill in the blank, the probability of me being an exceptional husband is pretty low. The probability of me being an exceptional father is probably even worse. The probability that I'm going to be focused at work and contributing is pretty low too. And by the way, we also know that there's a high correlation between mental health and other chronic illnesses. So this stuff is very real. It's persistent. And what you were talking about before, living in denial or keep your head down and suck it up, just doesn't work anymore. It may have worked when I was a kid, certainly not when you were. So for what we do, creating permission structures and empathy and acknowledging that this is normal. If you're in therapy, it doesn't mean you're not a normal person. We all suffer from something. It's a great saying a former boss once told me, which I happen to believe in quite a bit. Everybody that you know is suffering from something that you have no idea about. I'm gonna say that again.
Mm.
I promise you, every person in my life that I interact with, and myself included, suffer from things that are not visible to you or anybody else. And the level of to which I'm suffering with some of this is in many cases a mystery. So creating a permission structure fueled by empathy where people can, you know, not be ashamed for what they're going through. And in many instances, the life circumstances that are thrown at people are not of their own doing. So that some of this isn't even their fault many times. So the point to all of this is the more that you can sort of take it head on, demonstrate empathy, get people down the right care journey is critical. And by the way, if everything I just said you think is a bunch of BS, that's fine too. Let's just be very economic about it. Going back to what I was saying, things like absenteeism or presenteeism at work, being able to focus on my job versus being distracted by other things, uh, having mental health issues exacerbating a chronic illness. All this stuff impacts economics, it impacts productivity, it impacts getting things done in a workplace. So for me, even if you don't want to be an empathetic person or think it's a bunch of fluffy stuff, me coming to work and every day being engaged in what I'm doing has a real economic output. And if you care about that, if that alone is what you really care about, then you should be investing in this stuff. Which is why we see, if you look at our client base, the clients that buy our services, buy the services of our competitors, they believe what I just said, and in many cases they are naturally empathetic people.
Yeah, totally. I know even you guys listed modern health as you guys wrote an economic and performance lever for the employees, which I thought was very interesting, because
We
I
we yeah, we spent a lot of time and money on an ROI analysis for all those reasons.
yeah, I think it's very it even leads up to your point even of empathy, like, you guys understand that people are going through stuff, and if they want to be the best workers, right, the best husbands, the best wives, whatever it may be, it all starts with attacking the root problem, I guess you can say, right? I don't wanna justify, I know everybody's going through different stuff, but I love that so much. Shifting gears a little bit, talking more about, I guess, being a CEO in general is very interesting for me to learn from people who are, as cool and successful as you are.
I don't know.
Um, so I
But
wrote down, since 2014, you've held a lot of very cool positions. You've been CEO at 3 different companies. You're on the board of a couple of different companies as well. So my question to you, how do you learn to be so undeniably good at something that the world's best take a chance on you?
um, gosh, I'm not sure I have you're kind to say all that. I'm not sure I have. I'll try to offer you a thoughtful answer. I'm not sure. I'm not sure I'm going to come up with anything terribly novel here, but I think the way I think about, if you would have told me when I was your age, do you want to be a CEO one day when I was your age? My answer would have been, I'm still getting over the fact that life has dealt me a hand which says I can't be a professional athlete. Not that I was ever even close to
I understand.
it. When you grow up playing sports and you idolize, and you grow up in Chicago, I idolize Walter Payton and Michael Jordan and Frank Thomas and all these athletes. And I was a capable enough basketball player and tennis player. I thought I was good until you learn you're not that good, and your life of chasing, professional athletics isn't going to happen. And that, if for lucky for me, it happened early enough where my mom said, "Yeah, you're not going to be a professional athlete, so why don't you go study harder?" And that sort of that was a good piece of advice and led to some academic success, which was important in the arc of my career. Um, However, to answer your question, this isn't something that I woke up every day since I was your age saying I have to do this. So the first way I've sort of managed career stuff is a couple things. Number one, I've always viewed each job as sort of a 3 to 5 year thing. Hopefully, it can go longer, but I was always sort of, here's our job, here's what I want to accomplish in it. I didn't over rotate on things like getting promoted. I was very just focused on, let's just prove every day that I can do the work, do it well, and do it in a way where people wanted to work with me. I wanted to be a good colleague. That was very important to me. And I kind of said to myself, as long as I keep proving myself, and if I'm lucky enough to have the right bosses over time who will look after me, that, by the way, is probably the most important factor in my own career progression. I was lucky enough to have a couple mentors early on that took disproportionate care of me. That helped a lot. So the first thing is just sort of, it's going to be like, if you would have told me when I was at Hewitt Associates running corporate development, if that's as good as it was ever going to get for me career wise, I would have told you that that's still far exceeded anything I ever would have expected growing up in Illinois. I would never have thought I would have gotten that far. My dad was a CPA. He ran a local accounting firm. My mom was a therapist. Like, notions of like these big corporate careers, I just had no exposure to it. I had no idea. So I wasn't obsessed with it. That's sort of number one. Number two, I have been very compelled by this notion of repetition. People like, when people interview Steph Curry, how'd you become the greatest shooter of all time? It's like, because I sat in a gym and I shot literally thousands and thousands and thousands of 3 pointers. Um, I have modest OCD. So, and certain basketball players have OCD. If the ball isn't perfect, if the arc of the shot is not perfect, if it hits the rim and not just the net, it's not perfect. And you have to keep repeating. I had, in sports, it impacted me. OCD impacted sports because everything had to be perfect. So, what's been helpful is there's a lot of repetition in what I have done in certain roles, like doing transactions or running certain processes. And the more repetition you get, the better you get at something. I'd say the third thing, people say to me all the time, like, why on earth have you devoted so much of your life to this godforsaken industry, meaning benefits and HR stuff and whatever. And I say that very jokingly because I adore what I do. I really like what I do, but there are times where it's been tough. But building on a comment that David Brooks, the author, said, which I happen to believe in when he was giving advice to folks your age, he said, go learn something about something. Like in other words, Tom Nichols wrote a book called The Death of Expertise, which I happen to agree with his thesis that expertise matters. Um, Devoting your career to an industry, being patient enough to learn it, doing things in repetition, becoming expert in something was very important. So how did I get these jobs? And why, to your question, why did some really impressive people, why were they foolish enough to call me saying, would you come
No,
run?
don't say that.
No, I feel very lucky about it because it wasn't anything I planned or expected. But if you can demonstrate domain expertise that's differentiating, particularly in what I do. For to be successful in what I do, you really need to understand the ecosystem that we live in. And then to have the at bats and the repetition and to prove yourself over time, that has all really, really helped. But I think what I believe more than anything, which is where I started, um, and a lot of it was just pure luck. But you know, my life, I think people who very earlier in their life have this obsession. Like I've known people I've worked with who, when they were 22 or 23, right out of college, they would have said, like, I have to have this for my career, or I have to be on this path, or if in college, I have to be in this club, or I have to have this internship, or whatever. Not that I didn't care about any of that. I obviously did. And given where I grew up, it was a pretty like Glenbrook was a very competitive high school. Northwestern was very competitive college. University of Chicago was a very competitive business school. It's not that I was aloof to or in denial about any of this. I just wasn't so over rotated on it that as life took its pivots, I didn't view those as failures or knocking me off course, but really as sort of additive to building something over time. And in that regard, like I said, I've been very blessed that I had the right leaders and that gave me the right opportunities to prove myself. And I pinch like if you, I pinch myself. Like I'm an incredibly blessed person. I didn't expect any of this when I was your age.
That's so cool. It's funny you mentioned, so in the beginning, you said your first point was finding the right boss to potentially mentor you or just give you a piece of advice. I also had the same thing written down in 2022, which shows
No
that
way.
you think the same way. You 4 years later, you're thinking the same way. But
Yeah.
the first time when you presented at my high school, you said, "If you find the right boss that invests in you and trains you, they can teach you what to do and learn." I thought that was very interesting because it's right back at what you just talked about.
Yeah. Well, you got to be true to yourself and what got you here. I remember vividly, like throughout the course of my career, I remember like I worked at a company called IHS many years ago. My boss was a guy named Charles Picasso. It was a guy I absolutely adored. I love Charles. And he gave me, I was a consultant to his organization and he thought I was capable. And, he said, would you like to join us run corporate development? And I'm like, I'm 29 years old. You can get a whole bunch of people who are a whole lot more qualified than I am. I know next to nothing about most things, but in the course of this consulting project we did with him, I demonstrated, an intellectual curiosity, a work ethic, etc. And his basic, deal with me was, I'm going to give you a job you may not be qualified for, but your work ethic and your capabilities I've been impressed by, and I will take a chance on you. And I knew the risk he was taking because this was right before we were taking the company public. And my life was about to change profoundly because when you take a company public, you're an executive officer, your life becomes very public very fast. But he knew, in spite of the fact I was 29 and maybe a less experienced than I should have been, I would run through walls to make us be successful. I was not married. I was dating my wife at the time, or was when I was with my wife Denise. We were dating at the time. We didn't have kids, and he basically said, he's like, look, I am going to get 100 hours a week out of this kid, and I'm going to get the productivity of two people out of this one person that I'm only going to pay for one person. And I know he's going to do a good job for me. So I got, like I said, I got very lucky. It didn't come for free, but I was lucky enough to have the right mentor at the right time, and that experience sort of led to the next thing, which led to the next thing.
Yeah, that's crazy because another thing I had, written is you recommended so my question I remember asking you was if you recommend any books. That's when I was first getting into books, and I'm happy to say I'm still reading books. So, you recommended Good to Great by Jim Collins, which I ended up reading a while ago. It was a very good book, and it's cool how everything kinda fits into, I guess, your philosophies and what you're talking about even right now. My last question to you, Matt,
Yep.
is talking about, for the younger generation, I know you lecture and you are surrounded by a lot of people, like me, so when it comes to finding a mentor, when it comes to finding somebody that'll take a chance on you,
Yep.
how do you recommend going about that? How can you make people see what you can become, your potential?
That's a great question. I guess I've got a couple different thoughts in no particular priority or order, but going back to my mom, um, I know very little about most things. I've devoted a career to be in a domain where I'm pretty deep, but outside of that domain, I'm not. I read a lot. I try to be thoughtful, but I'm the first to tell you when I don't know the answer to something or if it's something I just am not experienced in. Which is to say, self awareness is just about the biggest gift you could ever be given. And I owe a lot to my mom, who uh, I wouldn't say straightened me out, but like when I misbehaved, she got in my face. And when I was behaving in ways that were not true to myself, she'd be like, "What are you doing?" Or, in social circumstances when I was trying too hard, she's like, like, why are you behaving like this? This is ridiculous. Just be yourself." So I think the first thing is the quicker you can figure out when you're looking in the mirror what that person of the reflection is all about and what you value, what you're not willing to put up with. Um, I'm sort of a forced extrovert. Took me a while to figure that out. In other words, you can put me in a room full of people. I occasionally embarrassing myself, but generally not. But I don't get I don't get tons of energy from. And, sort of definitionally, extrovert versus introvert. So the more, and you can take a bunch, like another example. My wife and I are actually quite opposite. I remember I took this thing called a learning styles inventory, which basically forces you to understand how you think. So we have 3 kids. My wife would buy a lot of these toys that have assembly required growing up. And I remember I was building a wheelbarrow for my son many, many years ago, and I screwed it up. I screwed up how you attached a wheel to the wheelbarrow. My wife was saying, had you just read the instructions and made piles with all of the components, you wouldn't have screwed that up, because that's what she does. And she's right. And I screwed up, but I learned what I screwed up, and then I got it right. I disassembled it, and then I got it right for the other 4 wheels. And that's just how I learn. I can't change. I'm more of an experiential learner. So my point is, the more that you can figure out what your how you work, how your mind works, how you learn, how you interact, what you get energy from, is all really important, because
Mhm.
that will help dictate the sort of environment in which you will likely succeed. So that's sort of issue 1. Issue 2 is you got to put yourself out there. For the extreme introverts, that's really tough. And for a forced extrovert like me, I don't like asking for things. I don't like asking for help. I don't even like asking for opportunities. But you have to push yourself at times, even though it may be counter to your character, to put yourself in those positions. So, what does that look like? That looks like volunteering for things. If there's a task force working on a certain initiative in your company, I raised my hand and said, "Hey, I'd love to help if you think I can be, useful." In meetings when you're with senior executives, I have forced myself over time. Yeah, when I was younger in my career, I'd show up The goal today is to show everybody how smart I am. That's what I'm going to do out of this meeting. And I'm going to have the bullet points in my head of what I want to say to make sure everybody knows how smart I am. What you learn over time is, it sounds cheesy, but it's true and it's parental advice. But you have one mouth and two ears. You might think about using them in proportion to what God gave you. In other words, why don't you listen to the question before you open your mouth and try to prove to everybody how smart you are? Be thoughtful in how you answer questions, how you choose to behave. Do you throw people under the bus? Do you take accountability? Do you behave in ways where a leader would say, yeah, I trust that person. I trust his character, etc. So, long-winded way of saying, for me at least, and again, I've been very blessed to have really pivotal mentors. But if you were to ask them the common denominator about me, at least, and again, I really don't love talking about myself because I spent my entire childhood with my mom talking about myself. So it's not what I love doing anymore. But my point is more if you were to talk to the people who were my mentors and who made a big difference in my career, I think they would say I'm generally uh, hardworking. I'm not self-promoting. I'm not always humble, but generally I really do try. Like nobody wants to like. I don't like talking about myself. I don't like bragging. Life is too short. And then I also realize and my wife has helped me with this a lot. Um, I'm just not that important. And what I mean by that is like take really accomplished CEOs, like Jamie Dimon, for example, one of the most accomplished CEOs, CEO of JP Morgan. Can you name who Jamie Dimon's predecessor was? I'll bet you can't. His name was William Harrison, and the only reason I know this is because I'm a Wall Street history nerd, okay? As important as Jamie Dimon is, in about 5 years when he's no longer running JP Morgan, most people won't remember who he is. So, you c I take what I do very seriously, building on how we started this discussion. How we serve our clients, how we serve individuals is very important to me. And our reputation associated with that is very important to me. Me personally, I really don't matter. Most people forget who I am shortly after I retire. So, not taking yourself too seriously, but taking the work very seriously is equally something that I think the bosses I've had over time would say is a characteristic of mine, and I think that's probably helped as well. Um, and then the final thing I would say, I worry a lot about your generation because in my generation, there was sort of this notion that if you worked hard and you behaved the right way, good things are going to come. You'll have a better life than your parents did. Like that was just sort of the implicit deal. And I worry a lot because people in your generation, for the first time, probably in the history of the country, don't necessarily feel that way. And how people in my generation got to career success can be very different than how it is for your generation. But I do think some of these lessons really do matter. You can be the best engineer in the world, you can be the best finance brain in the world. If you're a jerk, people generally don't want to work with you. If you can't find ways to make connections with people, they're not going to want to be on your team. So I think that there are some lessons that are sort of immutable over the generations. Um, but I think we're in a very different circumstance than we were when I grew up, and it's something that weighs on me quite a bit.
Sure. Matt, where can people find you at?
Where can they find me? I live in Chicago.
I guess that's a good point.
Yeah, I live in Lincoln Park, but if you're asking how they can find me, you hit me up on LinkedIn or you could get me on my emails on LinkedIn. So if you hit me up on LinkedIn, I generally hit accept, unless there's a really good reason not to. And I'm not giving out my phone number, but I'm a fairly approachable, easy to find person.
Awesome. And for those of you guys listening, thank you, and I will see you next Tuesday.